Okay, I'm now going to show you how to sew the top zipper if you are doing the birthing method. Now, I did switch fabrics because I'm using the green fabrics to make the binding method. And I did not do a full bag, so I just have, I cut a piece of the lining out of the exterior. This will be the front. And I have the back with its pocket, because remember, if you're doing the birthing version, you need to birth it through this back pocket and keep it open. And then I have the linings, and so I don't get confused, this one has RS for right side, WS for wrong side, and then this piece, which I believe is piece J. So piece H and piece J. I also have my zipper cut to the length in the pattern. This is not zipper tape. This is a longer zipper that I cut to a shorter length. And I have my 2 piece ends, which I made sure to cut out of the lining fabric or a thinner fabric, because these are going to be form lots of layers here. I don't want to make it too thick for my machine. So first, you can do this with an iron or just with your fingers, but I fold each zipper end towards the center and then flat. This is my first zipper end, and I'm going to slip it over the end of my zipper. And then I will do the same thing on the other side. Oops. And now I will top stitch over these. All right, I now have these zipper ends. If you are using a size 3 zipper, which is only 1 inch wide, then at this point your zipper end will be wider than your zipper. And for this one, for this top zipper, you can trim off the sides of the zipper ends if they are wider. I am now going to use my ruler and a pen to mark the center of this zipper end, so which is about at the 5/8 of an inch mark. And then I'm going to mark a 3/8 of an inch in one direction and 3/8 in the other. It's a little hard to see this one, but it's right here. And I'm going to repeat the same thing on the other end. This is going to be referred to as my center mark, and these as the seam marks. If you're using a size 3 zipper, you'll make these marks 1/4 inch away. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. it's probably best to do these with a fabric marker that'll come off. I'm just using a pen because I can see this easier with this color than my fabric markers. All right, you will need both your lining pieces, both your exteriors. You will also need 2 rectangle rings and your 2 3-inch webbing, pieces of webbing. I don't have those because I sewed them into the other purse, but I will tell you when you will use them. So I'm going to start with the lining piece H. It's right side up, and because I didn't use interfacing on this, it's hard to tell which is the right side and the wrong side, so I wrote RS, so right side. And I have my zipper with the zipper pull on the left. So what I do is I line this up with the edge, and I am going to be moving this up, but when I first start off, I just line it up with these end marks that you should have moved over from the pattern. And then I clip in between. Okay. And now I'm just going to get another clip on each end. Now I'm going to take this end and move it up so this seam mark is at the edge of the fabric. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Might be hard to see my seam marks, so I'll put it really close so you can see my seam mark is there at the end. Now I'm going to switch to my zipper foot. I'm going to baste this on. Before I sew the exterior to this, I am going to trim off this corner of the zipper and the zipper end. Okay, now I need my my exterior back. So this is the piece that has the pocket. And I'm going to, what I have here, you might be able to see it, is where I marked the end of the zipper. And you can see where it is marked on the lining as well. And I'm just going to match those markings up. Now, with my zipper foot, I'm going to sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And if you're doing the size 3 zipper, you can use a 1/4 inch for this. I'm going to start at this mark. That should be the end of the zipper. And I'm going to back stitch. And I am going to move this zipper pull away and then move it back. now I turn this wrong sides together. So remember, I have this WS for wrong side, and then the wrong side of this exterior. I put them together. You can press this with your iron. I'm just going to use my fingers right now. Now I am going to top stitch a little bit longer stitch, and I am going to start right here. I'm not going to top stitch next to glad that needle didn't break. I'm going to top stitch next to the zipper, but not next to the zipper end. So the front and the back. Okay. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the other lining and exterior. Okay. So here is my other lining piece. And this is the right side, you can tell because my dart right here. I am going to match up the end of the zipper end with my mark. Clip in between. Baste. Oops. Before I baste, I need to move this up so the seam mark is at the edge. Same thing over here. Trim off the extra. Now I match up the top of this, which is the exterior front, and if I had an actual bag, it would have the cell phone pocket here and a zipper pocket here, so it can be a little bit thick at some of these places. My mark is hard to see. I believe it is right here. Nope, here it is. Very hard to see. And this right here might be too tough for you to see, but I can tell where I marked it. All right, now I stitch with my normal seam allowance, and I start at this mark, a lot easier to sew when I don't have the thickness of the pockets. But if you do have the thickness of the pockets, just take it slowly and carefully at those parts. Here I am getting close to the end. And I'm straightening the fabric underneath because it was a little crooked. Okay. So now I will top stitch here at the top. And this is another place where it can be very thick. Top stitching over the fabric, so take it slowly. If I were using my vinyl from the green version, I would use my Teflon foot. I would use some stabilizer, some embroidery stabilizer. I use that later. I've also used that on the strap in a later video that you'll see. And it helps it slide really smoothly underneath the foot. Okay, so now you need your webbing and your rectangle rings. I don't have those, so I'll just summarize what you do. You take your piece of webbing and your rectangle ring and put each piece of webbing through one of the rings, and then I zigzag the end of the webbing together so it doesn't fall apart. You can sew your webbing to either the front or the back. I usually do the front because then I can center it right on top of this dart on the side, and I place it here with, here's my, say this is the webbing around the ring right here, and I have it extend 1/2 inch past the edge, and then I sew over this several times. Then on the other side, this is where I normally would have the cell phone pocket. I put this in the corner, the other webbing, the other ring. I try to make it parallel with the top of this piece right here, and I sew several times across. Now, if you don't want to deal with the bulk of the front, you can sew on the back top corners right here and right here. So now that we presumably have our rectangle rings and our webbing sewn on, we are going to sew the exteriors and the linings together. But before you do that, make sure your top is open, make sure your pocket is open. Otherwise, later on, you're going to turn your bag and realize it's impossible to turn because the pockets are zipped closed. So we're going to turn this so that the exteriors and the linings face each other. Now, at this point, make sure that your webbing and your rings, make sure that the rings are not folded up, otherwise they'll be in the seam allowance, so make sure they're folded towards the bag, and that your flat pocket for your cell phone, if it's getting in the way, usually I just unsnap it and then tuck it completely in the pocket, and that kind of keeps it from being as bulky right here. So I am going to clip this together all the way around. We're going to be going from the end of this seam all the way around to the end of the seam over here. And the same with the lining, but we're going to do the exterior first. Usually I start at one end and I start clipping. Then I go back to the other end and I start clipping. Right here can be kind of tricky. Oops, because it's on top of the webbing. So just clip carefully. Sometimes I find that as I am clipping things together, I end up with a little more fabric on the front than the back, and then I just kind of adjust all my clips a little bit until they all line up nicely. Because there's so many curves, it can be really easy for the fabric to kind of, oops, see here, I've got a little extra, so I'm going to just reposition this. It can be really easy for the one of the fabrics to, see, now it's perfect. One of the fabrics to stretch a little bit. Okay, I'm actually just going to sew this first, and then we will, I think my drawing shows both of them clipped, but we're going to just start with the exterior. Okay, depending on how thick your fabric is, it might be really hard to sew this end place right here, but you just try to straighten this as best as possible. One thing you can do is, for me, it's easier to sew towards these thick ends than to sew away. So I might start right here and sew all the way around and then come back to the end and sew approaching that with my normal foot. Or what you can do is use your sewing foot. Mine's stuck. I'm going to use my sewing foot just to start this off. And you're going to sew at the end of the, let me get this closer to the camera. See where this seam ends, where I sewed it? It's in white, so hopefully it shows up. That's where I'm going to start. Now my thread is stuck. Okay. So I'm going to sew this. Forgot. My machine has a little hiccup. I can't go all the way to the right position. Okay, there. So I'm going to keep this at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm actually going to switch now to my normal foot because it's easier for me to gauge the seam allowance. And normally I'd be sewing right across the webbing. So I'm going to sew across it, sew back, and then sew across again. Though if I had the actual webbing, I might have to slow down. Oops, I'm at a 1.5 inch on accident stitch length. So, okay, so I fixed my stitch length. Here I sew over the other side of the webbing, so back and forward, and this is very thick right here, so take it slow if you need to. And like I said before, it's easier to sew for me to sew toward the bulky end, and I don't think I should have to switch to my zipper foot here. So yep, I can make it, and then I can back stitch once I make it to that. So you can go ahead and trim the seam now or trim it later. I'm going to go ahead and trim it now. Oh, if I had the webbing, sorry, I keep forgetting the word webbing, I would not trim right here. So I'm going to pretend like I have the webbing, and I'm not going to trim right there. And I'm going to trim half the seam off all the way around. Also, I could tell that I almost sewed this pocket into the seam. Try not to sew that pocket to the seam. It makes it a lot harder to turn the bag. I'm going to get to the top, and I'm not going to trim the corner where the webbing would be. All right, and now I'm going to repeat that with the lining, but with one difference. We want the lining to fit nicely inside the exterior, and so we'll start off sewing with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then we will switch to 5/8 inch seam allowance. And that should help it to fit nicely inside. Once again, I've got fabric a little mismatched. So I'm going to, but neither of these are interfaced, which also makes them stretch a little bit more. So I just need to adjust this. Oh, it should be okay. All right, I'm going to start a little farther away, and I'm going to come back this way after I sew this so I can sew from this side. And so 5/8 inch seam allowance. Here I'm going to switch as I go around this corner back to a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to come up to this as best as I can. It's hard to see without bumping my head on my camera. Okay, good. And then I'm going to go back to this side, and oops. And I'm going to start here, make my way back to the end here. All right, and then I'm going to trim this all the way around. One thing I forgot to mention is for the exterior on some of these curves, the lining, it doesn't matter because this is going to be tucked inside in this same fashion, but the exterior is going to be turned right side out, and these seams are going to be going the opposite direction. And on the curves, you probably are going to want to use pinking shears if you have them, or use put some triangles in these curves, and that should help them a bit. Don't sew through your, or don't snip through your seam on accident. All right, so now we are done except for turning it right side out. So we're going to birth it through this pocket. And of course this version I have is super easy because it has no interfacing and no pockets. But I generally find that unless I use thicker vinyl, this turns pretty quickly and easily. Push the edges out, pull on the webbing parts, and then as I pull it out, I squeeze this seam like this to flatten it a bit. Now, if you happen to have a little bit of the end of the zipper end showing, that's why we did it the way we did, so that this is a closed end. There's no raw edge showing. Oops, I'm still attached to my sewing machine. Okay, and now I'm going to push the lining through. Let me see if I can go back a little so this isn't quite so up there. I'm going to push the lining all the way around into place. At this point, if your lining is still baggy, you can always turn it back and have a larger seam allowance if you want, but I find that the 5/8 of an inch works pretty well. Okay. So pretend this is the front with all the pockets. This is the back. And before I poke this in, it's time to sew it closed. And I'm going to fold these ends under or in 3/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to sew across this pocket bottom. This is all closed now. I'm going to stuff it down there and poke the corners in. Okay, and this is all complete except for the strap. So you'll have to go to the next video to see how to do the strap.